rugged south coast of Western Australia is geologically ancient and rich in both marine and terrestrial biodiversity. It's dominated by fine white sandy beaches, coastal dunes, granite headlands, limestone cliffs and over 500 islands, shoals and bommies that plunge into a sparkling southern ocean. The raw beauty, wide open spaces and natural environment of this region are what attract most of its population, who have learned to utilise these attributes both socially and economically. In this documentary, we'll explore the fascinating natural history of the area, the footprint modern man is leaving on the landscape, and what has been done to conserve this remarkable place. The south coast stretches across 1,000 kilometres of coastline and some of the oldest geological formations in an extremely ancient landscape. The geological history of the area extends back to the late Archean era, approximately 2.8 billion years ago. Unlike most other land masses in the world that have been subjected to relatively recent periods of glaciation, much of the West Australian landscape has been left exposed for millions of years to the effects of wind and the elements. As a result, the land here is severely eroded and weathered.
The story is of long drawn out periods between periods of quite significant change. When Australia drifted north away from Antarctica, the Earth's crust thinned until it broke at the tectonic edge, and it didn't come right back up to the full height, so there's a dip in it, and it's the top of the dip's the Ravensthorpe Ramp. The rifting process took place either side of around 160 million years ago.
During this upheaval, the continental plates overrode each other, and as the crust eroded away, the hardest parts, such as the barren ranges, were left standing.
Back during the Eocene, which is 30 to 80 million years ago, the sea levels were a lot higher. This is a long, long time ago. And the mountains behind the barrens were islands sticking up out of that ocean. And the spongylite rocks, which are all in the marine plain that lies all along the coast and is around the barrens, was an old seafloor. And the common life in that tropical ocean, as it was back then, were sea sponges that lived on the floor of the ocean.
At this time, when the ocean covered much of the present-day south coast and many of the mountain peaks were isolated islands, a diverse range of flora evolved. Descendants of these unusual plants still exist today.
Subsequently, the ice ages occurred and the water was drawn up into the ice around parts of the world and the sea levels dropped. The biggest changes were around 10 to 20,000 years ago. Most of the northern hemisphere was covered by glaciers, and the sea levels here were 85 metres lower than they are now.
It was during a period of low sea levels that the first Australians came, most likely island hopping from Southeast Asia and slowly moving southwards, finally reaching the south coast 20 to 40,000 years ago.
We know that the Aboriginal people, when they populated Australia and moved around the coastal environment, they didn't come through the centre, and hence why we're later than the western side of the south coast, because the people came down the west coast, along the south coast, and then across over towards South Australia.
Islands offshore, such as the Recherche Archipelago, were part of the mainland, with a coastline about 60 kilometres away from its present location.
These islands down here were very well used by Aboriginal people because they provided an abundance of food and wildlife, and also a lot of protection and shelter by the cavities that were created. But also the other thing is They were used as physical bearings.
Archaeological surveys have been carried out on the islands closer to today's present shoreline.
We found evidence of Aboriginal occupation on those islands. Now, archaeological research that has been carbon dated indicate that those islands were last joined about 20,000 years ago. And as the sea levels rose during that period of time, that basically forced the Aboriginal people to retract.
For thousands of years, they've seasonally roamed these lands, the oldest culture and the oldest landscape.
In the southwest of Western Australia, we have what we call the Noongar Nation, and there's 14 tribes in that Noongar Nation. We're the most eastern of that tribe.
Aboriginal people have a deep spiritual connection with the landscape, and they consider themselves belonging to it, rather than it belonging to them. An ancient culture steeped in mystery.
When the white man first started sailing past here, Aboriginal people were quite amazed at these unusual looking features. They thought they were ghosts. They were reincarnated forms of ancestors gone by.
There followed a period of international exploration along the south coast, beginning with the Dutch in 1626, followed by the British and the French, who charted the coastline, naming the many bays, headlands and the islands in their own honour. They were generally unimpressed with the landscape, it being so different from what they were used to in Europe. However, they knew that Indigenous people lived on the mainland, and many early explorers were keen to make contact with them. As word spread across Europe and the Americas of the bountiful supply of marine mammals in these waters, by the early 1800s, gangs of sealers and whalers lived and worked amongst the remote bays and rugged islands.
When we had the first contact here with the French, we then were visited quite frequently by whalers and sealers along the south coast. And these guys were not only pretty notorious, they were pretty rough and rugged guys. And basically, when they were coming along the south coast and seeing the Aboriginal people, there was a lot of interaction and fighting and feuding, mainly over the women. And you know, it's not rocket science to work out, the interaction created a lot of angst and fear because they were only protecting their wives and their daughters from this invasion.
These early mariners ate Cape Barren geese and fish, occasionally making the run to Albany to sell their seal skins and stock up on supplies. But before too long, they depleted seal numbers and the bounty was no longer profitable. However, the whaling industry continued, and Albany later had its own whaling station, the last remaining in Australia, until it ceased operations in 1978. Meanwhile, many other ships were coming. There was a race to claim the south coast and establish a settlement. Although the British had claimed and named King George III Sound in 1791, they had no continuous presence there. But with the French showing an interest in establishing a settlement, the British were spurred on to stake their claim. In 1826, a party of convicts and soldiers aboard the brig Amity arrived from Sydney and planted the British flag on the mainland, becoming the first white settlement in Western Australia. Contrary to the hostile interactions with sealers and whalers, things were much more amicable between Indigenous people and the European settlers on land. Some of the Aboriginals lived in settlers' huts with them, dressed in white man's clothes, and spoke a kind of pidgin English. They were happy to shake hands plenty with their new friends, the white man. Early exploration of the inland terrain was greatly assisted by the Aboriginals, who led them along the walking trails the Noongar people had maintained for generations. Little did they know, these white folk were here to stay, and they now considered this land theirs. settlers began to travel vast distances to the region looking for arable land to plant crops and graze livestock. The old Strawberry Hill farm in Albany was the first farm in Western Australia. From 1827, it produced the state's first wheat, barley and maize crops. These pioneers did it tough, opening up large parts of the region for agriculture. After World War II, during the 1950s and 60s, the state government pushed for the clearing of 1 million acres a year. Under this short-sighted policy, large areas of marginal land that was not really suitable for broad-scale farming was opened up. By the mid-1980s, the rate of large-scale clearing had slowed, but by then about 90% of the original wheat belt vegetation had been removed. Although integral to the growth and development of the region, broad-scale land clearing has decimated habitats for native flora and fauna, and is a primary reason many species have become rare or threatened. In many cases, the process simply left too little vegetation to support viable populations of native plants and animals. The South Coast was always one of the biologically richest parts of southwestern Australia. Following the decades of clearing, it now has a higher concentration of rare, threatened or endangered flora and fauna than most other parts of Australia. This is one of the reasons it's part of the Southwest Botanical Province, one of only 34 worldwide biodiversity hotspots. Around 700 known plant species are endemic, only found along the south coast, and this high level of endemism is another reason for its hotspot listing. Groups involved in the ambitious collaboration, the Gondwana-linked partnership, have started purchasing properties to provide wildlife corridors between the remaining habitat areas. Led by Keith Bradby, they aim to reconnect across heavily cleared areas, building a more ecologically resilient landscape.
What we're basically saying is that you've got probably one big opportunity across all of southwestern Australia to get health back into the country and abundance back into the wildlife. And that's across the 1,000 kilometres from the bottom of the west coast, Margaret River area, right through to the Nullarbor, which runs from that really wet forest to that really magnificent dry woodland. Over 900 kilometres of that is bush. Most of it's pretty intact, as healthy as we've got left. And with a bit of effort, it can all be connected. We'd like to see it all functioning ecologically. It can be the pathway through which all the wildlife can move backwards and forwards as they need to. And I think it can be a great symbol of hope for all the other battered bits of Australia in the world. And indeed it has been. You know, we started off, everyone knew we were crazy, we knew we were crazy. There are now Gondwana-like programs happening all across Australia. There's probably been 3 or 4 big impacts on the bush of the southwest. The first one was the disruption of the Noongar pattern of management, which was, I believe, much more detailed and proactive than we give them credit for. And when we disrupted that, we blew away their burning patterns, have never been able to get back to anything there, and started to see, you know, the beginning of the end for a lot of wildlife. For a lot of the southwest, the big clearing didn't really happen until the 1950s and 1960s, incredibly recent. And because a lot of the southwest was only cleared in the last 50 years, we're not seeing the full impacts of that yet. So we're in a position where by connecting up quickly, we will keep those populations in most areas.
The Gondwana Link Alliance works closely with many environmental restoration groups and individuals, as well as farmers, who've seen their properties degrading as a result of overclearing, to carry out revegetation of native plants and restore health to the bush.
I think one important element of our work is that we're not trying to create some 1,000-kilometre long national park. It's got to be a working landscape. It's got to be a landscape that's got farmers in it, it's got miners in it, it's got plantation growers in it, and so on. And we've worked with all of those industries wherever we can to work out what a right balance is in a landscape. The important work is the intense local small-scale stuff that happens. The work that one group's doing between the Porongurups and the Stirlings, another group's doing between the Stirlings and the Fitzgerald. And every group that we're working with has achieved significant progress in keeping in place some of the local endemic stuff that we would have otherwise lost.
Although a vast undertaking, the program is achieving inspiring outcomes through reduced soil salinity, erosion and habitat damage, with some significant increases in populations of key wildlife and endemic plants.
You can go back to places which were just going downhill at a pretty fast rate of knots and are now flourishing bits of bush with stable soil, good bushy ground cover, trees up above your head, birds everywhere. And then when Bush Heritage and the other guys do their monitoring programs, you discover the pygmy possum have moved in and the black glove wallabies have been feeding there since year 3 or so on.
The world is in the middle of a major extinction event, arguably the most severe since the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. The major difference is that modern extinctions are caused by humans and are happening so fast in evolutionary terms that whole systems are also collapsing. On the south coast, 12 species of mammals and 2 bird subspecies are presumed extinct since European settlement. Climate change is now adding further stress to those vulnerable species, hanging on in the fragmented landscape.
I've got a house in town, it's got an insurance policy. I've got a big bit of bush across southwestern Australia, we're trying to build the insurance policy. And it's not a very expensive exercise compared to what we would stand to lose if we don't. It's all under a lot of stress now. Climate change is just going to accelerate all those stresses. So connected, healthy, and loved.
Thanks to the foresight of individuals in the past, large areas along the south coast have been set aside as national parks or reserves. The Department of Parks and Wildlife, or DPAW, manage these areas for wildlife conservation, scientific study and public enjoyment. These incredible landscapes and ecosystems that support our much-loved biodiversity are also fundamental to the tourism industry and local economy. With around 18 million hectares to manage, the regional leader for nature conservation, Dion Utber and his team, have a big job.
The resources that need particular attention through the work that we do are the flora and the fauna and the landscapes and habitats in which they exist, and then also the ecological processes that underpin their survival. The South Coast is fairly significant because of the flora and the fauna and the uniqueness and diversity that we have, and that really extends out through the southwest of Western Australia, which in international terms is a global biodiversity hotspot. So there's 34 named biodiversity hotspots, and the southwest is one of those. And then within the southwest, the south coast stands out in particular for its high levels of diversity, plant diversity in particular, and also high levels of endemism. And this is a great position to be in, to be one of the jewels in the crown of the Southwest Biodiversity Hotspot. I think one of the greatest threats to biodiversity on the south coast is Phytophthora dieback. It's very difficult to know where it is until it's actually in that environment. It's spread by people, and so it can be moved through the environment quite fast. And once it gets into an area, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to remove. Probably the best deterrent of introducing dieback is to avoid the movement of soil into an area, and during dry soil conditions the risk of that movement is minimal. As soon as the environment and soil starts getting wet, it adheres to cars, to boots, to equipment, and it is easily moved, and the disease moves with it. We're working closely with organisations such as South Coast NRM and local community groups to try and promote the awareness of dieback, encourage people to be clean in the environment when they're driving around in it, not to go spreading mud around and potentially dieback into our pristine and highly valued coastal areas. Some of the national parks that stand out on the south coast include the Stirling Range National Park, the Fitzgerald River National Park, and even Cape Parrot National Park. The Stirlings has over 1,500 plant species. It's one of the few montane areas in the southwest, with peaks up to 1,000 metres high. Likewise, the Fitzgerald River National Park also has montane environments, but it has a wide diversity of environments within the national park. It's just under 300,000 hectares. It's probably the single largest national park in the southwest of Western Australia, and because of its size it has this intactness, it has its diversity of landscape and habitat. It's been recognised internationally as a UNESCO biosphere.
UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, designated the Fitzgerald River Biosphere Reserve in 1978, and it's one of only 2 such reserves in Western Australia. Biosphere reserves are areas where man's sustainable interaction with nature can be measured, researched, implemented and celebrated.
And then Cape Parrot National Park over in the east, which then extends out into the Northland Nature Reserve, is also significant because it's a large coastal area that's intact. It's one of the 2 remaining areas where the western ground parrot is still in existence, and it's a critically endangered parrot.
Nearly 3/4 of Western Australia's threatened terrestrial birds and 29% of threatened terrestrial mammals occur along the south coast. DPAW's regional ecologist Sarah Comer works closely with a team of scientists and community volunteers to implement recovery plans for a range of threatened species.
We're out here doing a number of jobs that are related to understanding how effective our management of the reserve is for fauna, and we have 2 sites set up out in the park with a series of different trap types, and they're monitored every spring and autumn. Out in Cape Parrot, we've been catching things like the southern brown bandicoot, and we've certainly seen good numbers of those this week.
And she's got a pinky. Now this is special, somebody attached to the nipple.
Working with cute marsupials might seem like a dream job, but there are dangers involved.
We've got a dunot. Wow. Yeah, they bite us. Ha ha! Ha ha! He's on. Yeah, that's a dunot for you. You need to let go now. Come on. I don't want to hurt you. Oh, okay.
Here's 20.
We catch the native bush rat, the small native rodent, and then we've been getting honey possums.
Honey possums have a specialised brush-tipped tongue to lick nectar from the flowers they solely survive on, so a high variety of flowering plants are particularly important to them. One of the greatest impacts on native animals is predation by introduced species, in particular the European fox and feral cat.
We're also radio tracking and trying to retrieve some of the collars that we had on feral cats. We baited the park using the Eradicate cat baits in March, so now we're looking for the GPS collars that were on the feral cats that we collared in January. This work that we're doing down here is the first time that the cat-specific baits have been used in the southwest. They're little sausage-type shaped baits. So it has some secret ingredients that present, like an oily exterior. So it actually looks like a sausage that you might want to cook and eat. It's attractive. Well, if you're a cat anyway, a feral cat. And the active ingredient is 1080, which is a poison that occurs naturally in around 40 species of plants in the Gastrolobium genus. So it's a toxin that the native fauna have evolved with, and so they have developed a resistance. So it's very effective in controlling introduced predators and doesn't impact on the native species. The fox and the feral cat have done exceptionally well in these environments, and we've actually got photos of them out here with bandicoots in their mouth. The early signs are that we are impacting the feral cat population, and certainly that we're impacting the fox population as well, because they will take the cat baits.
One species that has suffered from feral animal predation, almost to the point of extinction, is the elusive western ground parrot.
We're also monitoring two of the little subpopulations that are the stronghold of the western ground parrot, which is critically endangered. Basically, this is it for that population now. There's a small number of birds left in the Fitzgerald River National Park, but the bulk of the animals are here.
Originally found throughout near coastal Western Australia, from north of Perth to east of Esperance, the population has now alarmingly been reduced to 2 small pockets on the south coast.
The next step from critically endangered is extinction. There's not many left. Our last estimate of population was that there was less than 110 individuals left in the wild.
Rarely seen, the western ground parrot is a challenge to monitor.
Well, I was working with them for 5 years before I saw one. I guess because we work out there, we tend to see them from time to time, but they're not commonly seen. You have to be very lucky, and their colouring is very cryptic and helps them blend in really nicely to the vegetation. They forage on the ground. They spend the day moving around in this low heath, which is very rich in seeds and flowers. They do fly, and they're quite capable of strong flight, but it's uncommon to see them flying.
Being so secretive, the best way to survey numbers of western ground parrots is to listen for their distinctive calls as the birds move from their daytime feeding ground to their nighttime roost.
Well, the peak calling time is usually about 40 minutes before sunrise and 40 minutes after sunset, so that's when we usually head out listening. We sort of listen for an hour either side in the mornings and the evenings. Okay, that's one calling now. It basically rises in pitch with every call. Something like a kettle boiling.
The numbers are so low that without careful management, the western ground parrot is likely to become extinct in the next decade.
We can't continue to let things go without trying to conserve them. If we lose the ground parrot tomorrow, what's next? And it's our responsibility to look after that for our generation and future generations.
Other threats to biodiversity include the spread of exotic weeds such as bridal creeper and freesias, which compete for space with native plants. And although some native plant species have adapted to regenerate after fire, most animals are unable to survive the damage to their habitat. One species, particularly vulnerable to the effects of fire on its habitat, is Gilbert's potoroo. Originally discovered in 1840 by naturalist and explorer John Gilbert, they were seldom seen again and were declared extinct for around 130 years, until 1994 when they were rediscovered in the Two Peoples Bay area east of Albany. A deep haul recovery program has brought these critically endangered marsupials back from the brink. From only 40 animals, they've increased the population and established another colony near Mount Many Peaks. Led by Principal Research Scientist Tony Friend, the program is achieving amazing results.
Well, the potoroos were always found in a fairly small area of the south coast, from an area between Albany and Margaret River. For some reason the potoroos declined in their range, and we can only speculate about how that happened. I think the best explanation probably involves separate populations being caused by fragmentation, so clearing between isolated colonies, and then one by one the colonies died out until we ended up with only one left at Two People's Bay.
After its rediscovery, a breeding colony was established in captivity. A few young were born in the first couple of years, but then breeding stopped for no known reason. So a different approach was taken, and some animals were released onto nearby Bald Island, where they successfully bred up in the predator-free environment.
By 2011 we had 60 animals on the island, so it was really important to take advantage of this rapidly growing population to provide animals to move to other areas. An area near Mount Many Peaks was suitable for potoroos, and a fence was built around 380 hectares. Since then we've moved 36 animals into this enclosure, and the population here is now starting to grow. We've had lots of breeding. We've recorded 17 or 18 young that are born in the enclosure, and we're seeing this population starting to grow successfully as well. We figure there's about 130 of them at the moment. That makes it one of the rarest mammals in the world. In fact, the rarest marsupial that there is in the world anywhere. We census the potoroos 3 times a year. Now with the new enclosure as well as Two People's Bay, it takes us 6 weeks each time we do it. We gather information on the numbers. Each animal is marked so we can tell how many we catch. So 68B, 58F9, okay, that's female 162. We weigh them and we check their condition and check them for parasites and make general observations. There's the tail. We better put you back. Particularly the females, we have a look at the pouch and see how they're breeding. We measure the size of the young, so we can see how, basically count the number of young that are being produced. Got teeth in the mouth. Yeah, she's got her teeth in the mouth. She's not letting go. This is a little female. She's about a month and a half old at this age, and she'll get about, probably 4 times as big before she comes out. All closed up. Good girl.
Gilbert's potoroo have a specialised diet of fungi and truffles, which they dig up from underground, therefore playing a crucial role in nutrient cycling and the health of soil.
I'm pretty optimistic about the future of Gilbert's potoroo. I think we've been lucky that the species breeds well in the wild. Off you go, see you tomorrow. We've got a great team of people working together on the species. I think the community, definitely the community in Albany, wants to hang on to the potoroo. Now that's really important. The fact that we've got a community group that's been formed specifically to save the potoroo means that they want to hang on to those really rare things. As a society, we have a responsibility to look after the biodiversity that we've inherited. Australia has a mass of fantastic animals, and people come from all over the world to see them. So we're going to let them go extinct? I don't think so. There are reasons to put a lot of effort into conserving our really rare species.
Most life depends on fresh water, and the health of waterways along the south coast is influenced by activities directly upstream from them. Several rivers and estuaries in the region are in pristine condition. However, many waterways are showing signs of degradation, in particular the loss of fringing vegetation due to clearing to the water's edge, or damage by grazing stock, resulting in high levels of erosion and sedimentation. High sediment loads from cleared areas can transport large amounts of nutrients downstream, causing algal blooms. This affects fish communities, bird life, and ultimately biodiversity. Environmental consultants Steve and Geraldine Janicki, along with other individuals, community groups and state government agencies, are helping build the knowledge base of South Coast waterways to manage and protect these lifebloods.
The wetlands and waterways have been of great importance to Indigenous people for thousands of years, not only as a resource to survive, but in social and cultural terms, spiritual terms. And in our Western culture, in many ways we've lost touch with these systems. The network of waterways is the main thing that connects the landscape together from an environmental point of view. And for all creatures and plants and animals and people, of course, draw on the waterways as a resource, sometimes directly, if they want the water, sometimes indirectly in terms of recreation or simply being able to live in the landscape and enjoy living there. The drainage network is essential to our overall health and mental health. There's quite a number of rivers on the south coast, probably about 15 to 20 major systems and many smaller ones in between.
Two broad aquatic bioregions have been identified for river systems in the region: the western south coast from Gardner River to Bluff River, and the eastern south coast from the Pallinup River through to Thomas River.
The river systems were formed a long time ago, of course, but what is characteristic is when Antarctica and Australia parted company, the south coast border, as it were, slumped, and the streams and rivers that may have flowed more northerly and inland then started to flow south. So we have very short rivers on the south coast flowing from perhaps 100 kilometres inland fairly directly down to the ocean. On the whole, the river systems of the south coast are in reasonable condition. There are degrading influences taking place, but because it's been cleared relatively recently, a lot of those processes are in their early phases.
Catchment clearing and altered land use resulting in changed hydrology and increased salinity levels are major threats to rivers in the region and can be associated with increased erosion, sediment transportation and altered turbidity and nutrient levels.
We're trying to understand how to balance use of the resources, which we need, with preserving the parts of the system that need to operate in a natural way. But an interesting thing's happened over the last 100 years, that people have been moving off the land. There's fewer people in the country towns, farms are getting larger, and people are concentrating more in the cities. As a result, lots of landowners are struggling to be able to make their businesses work and do good environmental management at the same time. But most farmers want to do the right thing by the land, and they are struggling to be able to fit that into a busy day. Determining the health of waterways is quite complex. There's a number of factors involved. We would look at the actual structure of the channel, the water quality, of course, which includes its salinity, acidity, amount of oxygen in the water, temperature. Temperature is quite a significant factor. The other quality of the river that we look at is what's called the riparian zone, which is the fringing vegetation and the floodway, looking at the composition of the vegetation, the health of those plants. Are they looking healthy? Are they dying? Are they being replaced by weeds? One of the changes that has been observed in a waterway as a result of negative impacts has been a shift in the nature of the species living in the pools along the river. Generally, in a pristine environment, we might expect many different species, but in low numbers for each species, whereas in a degraded system, we can expect to see fewer species, but in very large numbers. The greatest threat to our waterways, outside of the changes to the landscape, is the indifference of the population. One thing we can do as a community to help ensure the future health of our waterways is to value them ourselves and impart those values to our children. And I think it means getting out of the classroom, letting young people experience the natural environment and discover and explore in those areas. So very much an educational component. That applies to adults as much as it does to children. And children will pick up the values of their parents.
Conserving and restoring river systems will help improve water quality and ecosystem health, reducing environmental problems in estuaries and coastal wetlands. Many of the South Coast waterways are known globally for their ecological values. Lake Gore and Lake Warden in Esperance are Ramsar wetlands, an international treaty that focuses on the conservation and wise use of wetlands and their resources. They were listed for their unique system of interconnected lakes and provision of a major refuge for resident and migratory shorebirds. However, in previous years, the Lake Warden catchment has been inundated by heavy rainfall, which has resulted in the death of vegetation along the shoreline and reduced the beach area available for shorebirds to nest and to feed. A collaborative effort between Esperance Regional Forum, landowners, DPAW and other project partners has implemented revegetation works in the catchment. In combination with engineering solutions to lower the water levels to depth ranges suitable for the recovery of shorebirds and increase the beaches, this is allowing fringing wetland vegetation to regenerate. DPAW monitor water depth, salinity and pH levels of selected wetlands at regular intervals. This monitoring is essential to keep track of impacts on water quality. The South Coast is an extremely important area for a wide range of shorebirds, usually found on sandy beaches and near intertidal habitats or inland wetlands. They feed by wading in shallow waters and probing wet mud or sand with their bills. While many shorebirds are residents here all year round, some migrate annually from the other side of the globe, from as far away as Siberia, stopping over at vulnerable locations along the way, such as the Yellow Sea in China, where wetlands are under pressure from development. They spend the summer feeding in places, including the wetlands of the south coast of WA, to build up energy reserves for their long journey home. BirdLife Australia conducts annual shorebird counts with the help of volunteers and bird groups across Australia to monitor numbers and potential threats to the bird's future. As part of the community conservation project, Shorebirds 2020, Dr. Golo Mora runs workshops to assist volunteers in their identification skills.
Shorebird migration is one of the most amazing feats in the animal kingdom. It takes little birds that weigh as little as 30 grams all the way from their Arctic breeding grounds, which can be as far away as Siberia or Alaska, 10 to 12,000 kilometer journey down here in a matter of weeks or only a couple of months, and have lost a lot of their fat reserves by the time they get here. So they normally get straight into feeding and rebuilding their body fat, and they can put on up to 75% of their body weight in the time, about 6 months that they spend here. So that's really a sign of how incredibly productive and rich these Ramsar wetlands are.
Even when wetlands are healthy and intact, there are a number of threats to the survival of shorebirds, such as increased disturbance by people, dogs and vehicles, which make many areas unsuitable for them.
The shorebird species that I think are most vulnerable around this area are amongst the resident shorebirds, probably the hooded plovers. And amongst the migratory shorebirds, we've got a wide range of species that actually rely on this area. So commonly you would see sharp-tailed sandpipers or red-necked stints, which really rely on this area as a terminal stop on their long migration from the Arctic. So they really need to find a rich food source because they have to travel another 10 or 12,000 kilometers back in only half a year's time.
Over 1,300 birdwatchers nationwide volunteer their time to count shorebirds and take part in this citizen science, which provides important information about these intrepid little birds.
There's a lot of things we can do just by being aware and looking out for them. There's a very sort of individual responsibility to help those shorebirds make the journey back.
For the same reason we have well-managed and protected areas on land, there's a growing understanding that the ocean, which supports a unique and diverse range of species and sensitive marine habitats, needs to be well managed and protected too. State marine waters extend from the coastline out 3 nautical miles, including 3 nautical miles offshore of islands. Beyond this is Commonwealth waters. The glistening Southern Ocean wraps around headlands and islands, a luminous and inviting turquoise tint. For many, life revolves around the ocean. It's home to a diverse range of ocean-going animals adapted to suit the cold temperatures and high-impact coastline. Southern right whales rely on stop-off points in their migratory path, dotted all along the south coast. These oceanic giants annually pull into specific areas to breed, calve and rest, providing an opportunity for people to watch in awe as they teach their newborn calves the way of life. The temperate marine environments of the south coast are known for their high biodiversity. Endemism is also high, particularly amongst the invertebrates such as sponges, with 156 sponge species recorded in these waters. A major ocean current, the Lewin Current, originates in the tropics and makes its way down the West Australian coast, wrapping around Cape Lewin and heading east as far as Tasmania in some years. It brings warm, nutrient-poor waters to the south coast and has a substantial influence on the region's marine species and climate. The south coast is also directly influenced by cold Southern Ocean currents, and this mixture of waters results in unique assemblages of tropical, subtropical, but predominantly temperate marine species. Offshore islands such as the magnificent Recherche Archipelago provide important habitat, breeding and resting sites for many species of seabirds and 2 species of marine mammals, which are kept in check by the top of the food chain. In comparison with similar marine environments around the world, the waters here are not highly productive. A small commercial fishing fleet rely on the bounty beneath the surface to make a living. The largest commercial fisheries of the south coast are the abalone fishery, demersal gillnet fishery for sharks, and the purse seine pilchard fishery. commercial fishers are implementing smarter fishing practices with support from Ocean Watch Australia, CNET and the West Australian Fishing Industry Council. Jay Shoesmith from CNET helps fishermen integrate these sustainable practices into their fishery.
My particular role is I'm the CNET Extension Officer for West Australia.
Pretty slow, but it's getting there. Yeah, fish are a long way off the coast.
Institutions such as universities, the government may have some research projects that they need to distribute amongst the commercial fishing industry. So part of my role is to go out and extend the research done by other institutions. Further to this, part of our role at CNET is to work with commercial fishermen and mitigate the bycatch within their fishery.
The pilchard fishery has adopted a practice to reduce the bycatch of fleshy-footed shearwaters, a threatened migratory bird that gets caught in their nets while trying to feed on the pilchards as they're drawn to the surface.
A few years ago they had a large problem with shearwater captures. Part of this led to using different sort of bycatch measures, whether it be trying different baiting to using water cannons that drive the shearwaters away. We found that the most appropriate method for reducing shearwater capture is a boat tow-off, which is the use of a small tinny to pull the net away and pull the folds out of the net. In this turn reduces the shearwaters being captured.
The bulk of the interaction between shearwaters and commercial vessels occur in March and April of each year, when the shearwaters come to nest on the local islands and take advantage of the abundant food source. After implementing this method, fishermen have managed to reduce the capture and death of shearwaters from around 1,000 down to 120 birds per year, and hope to see this number drop further.
Working with commercial fishermen into the future, we hope to further reduce the amount of bycatch and keep our oceans clean.
Recreational fishing is a popular pastime, with fishers targeting whiting, trevally, salmon and shark from shore. While boat anglers prize red snapper, blue groper, tuna and queen snapper. The Department of Fisheries sets bag and size limits based on extensive research which are there to protect this precious marine resource from overfishing. Despite all the activity based on the ocean, to date there's only been a relatively small amount of research done on its habitats and inhabitants. The South Coast Marine Region is an important area for research because of its relatively undisturbed status, diverse habitats, unusual current systems and high diversity of marine life for a temperate region. Scientific research has been conducted by tertiary institutions, government agencies, private entities, NRM bodies, groups and individuals. Information has been gathered in areas including mapping and monitoring of benthic habitats, fish communities and marine mammals. As pressure on marine environments grows with increasing resource use and industry development, these pressures, if not well planned and managed, have the potential to impact on marine environments with pollution, the introduction of marine pests and loss of biodiversity and habitats being major risks. A regional marine strategic planning process is underway for state waters from Cape Leeuwin to the South Australian border, which involves the development of a comprehensive and integrated approach to the sustainable use and conservation of these waters. There's a need to continue with marine research, planning and management initiatives for the South Coast to fill information gaps, ensure that biodiversity is conserved and marine resources are sustainably used. Natural Resource Management, or NRM, works with communities to enhance the restoration and preservation of our region's unique natural assets the land, water and native flora and fauna that live within it. One of the core principles of NRM is sustainable development and use of natural resources by agriculture, mining, tourism, fisheries and forestry. It acknowledges people's livelihoods are reliant on the natural environment, but also the responsibility of the people to ensure that the environment is thriving. South Coast NRM is the organisation responsible for this region, and part of their role is to engage the community to connect with nature and develop a sense of stewardship for the natural resources on which our futures ultimately depend. Through activities such as native vegetation planting days with community members, coastal rehabilitation works, marine and coastal research, and workshops with school groups where kids can learn the causes of environmental degradation and how they can help. South Coast NRM raise awareness of issues and encourage people to become involved in managing their natural resources across the region.
Whoa! What eats jellyfish? Sharks. Yep. Turtles.
There is a lot of great work being done to conserve the natural assets of the South Coast, but more needs to be done. By working together, NRM groups, agencies, community groups and individuals can become partners in research and management to address the threats to this incredible region. The South Coast community utilise, enjoy and are ultimately responsible for a very unique part of Australia and the world. Sometimes the only value given to the living environment relates to how much wealth can be extracted from it. But by understanding that natural ecosystems are made up of complex, interdependent relationships and looking after biodiversity, we can help build resilience to the effects of climate change. This region is a rich and healthy ecosphere that is set for huge growth and development in the future. New proposals are currently being considered, which include further mineral resource development and port expansions and leases for offshore petroleum exploration. Pressures on the environment are numerous and becoming more severe, and with more than 70% of the terrestrial coastal environment under some form of conservation management, the demands to develop the remaining areas will only increase. As a community, we need to decide whether there are more ecologically sustainable ways we can benefit from our natural resources. Looking after biodiversity is in our own best interest, environmentally, socially, and economically. We must regard ourselves as guardians of this remote and rugged expanse, carefully managing it for the future.